we've pretty much heard it across the board. So I think the final program will just basically say, you know, we're putting a 2030, you know, future date on this, and that's what we're planning for, and there's a no growth kind of scenario here. So in walking through how we set up this program, you know, a number of staff is obvious. DGSF, that stands for Department Gross Square Footage. Okay. So this room, let's say it's, I don't know, 400 square feet. I think it's bigger. It's bigger than that. It's not what it should be, but let's say it's 1,000 square feet. That would be what we would call the net square footage, or the assignable square footage. That's the size of the room that you are operating in and that you can function in. When we talk about department gross, let's say this room was next to toilets, it's next to some other meeting rooms and conference rooms. This whole thing is a unit. It happens to also be a building, but let's pretend it was just more like a department inside another building. That has little circulation spots, it has walls, you know, it has some of these extra little spaces and construction that adds some additional square footage. And so we use a percentage to get to the point of what we call departmental gross square footage. Then if this is part of a bigger building, and let's say that has more public corridors and it's got exterior building walls, and if it's two-story, it might have stairs and elevators and more circulation, and it might have some mechanical spaces. Then there's another factor for anything that we don't specifically assign a space value to that we call building gross square footage. And we'll factor it again to account for all of those types of extra space growth. And it all breaks up or down from what you actually need physically in a room in order to have the function happen. So when you see DGSF, it's basically saying, you know, we looked at the city management and finance department, and we looked at each individual room, and we added them all up, and we put a percentage factor on top of that to account for their walls and circulation between them, and we called it department gross square foot for city management and finance. It's kind of minor. We will be looking at that more carefully. It could be anything from 15 to 35%. And it just depends. Like if you have a lot of private offices and you have to have hallways between them all, that's a lot of extra gross square footage.
We're hoping to not have a lot of private offices, open flexible space.
You have a mix. Yeah. And a mix, you know, might get you to more like 20, 25, 20 maybe. Right now I've got them all at the maximum, so if you see the breakdown, don't be alarmed, but this is the draft stage, and you know, I'm hoping this is the worst
You're using
case.
Gross factor like load factor plus a traditional net to gross, right?
Exactly, right. Exactly.
Yeah.
So can I ask a question about final product?
Mm-hmm.
Do you ever tier things? And I mean basic, bare bones, middle, and everything you could want, including a shooting station in the basement.
I think that that's some of what I want to talk about today,
Okay.
Without actually maybe having answers, you know, adapted to exact values. I do want to talk theoretically about how we should approach that, because we have a couple different things we actually have to parse these around. As we start to look at options, for example, if these were all individual buildings, the grossing factors would be higher than if some of them were glommed into one building. So that's one way that the program space we're actually planning for in one scenario is A, and another scenario it's B. As you've said, if we have some things on the table once we kind of get to this point of, yeah, the program is pretty well set, that we believe are, here's the basic, absolute minimum to function, we're all comfortable with it, but here were 3 things that the community would really, really like if you could afford it. We can also parse option A, option B with those kinds of potential additions. So I want to talk through that as we kind of conclude on the programming stuff. Just theoretically, what are the most useful kinds of things to study, and how do you want to see that brought forth in the process? But hold the thought for a minute so I can help you understand where we are so far. I wanted to show you this table. You can see there's the library value that's, you know, kind of been held right now. I just grabbed these numbers from what we got. I don't even know for sure if I'm always grabbing the right numbers in the 2012 program. I just grabbed the gross square footage numbers and plugged them in so you can see the comparison. Obviously the police department is missing in all cases. There was a sheet in there for the library. It looked different than the rest of the program, so I'm not even sure it was an accurate thing to refer to in the first place.
Where did you get this? What is it? The Town Center Task Force report?
Yeah, I think it was in there.
We didn't look at the library, except,
There was-
it's just, no, it was here, it's an existing building.
We have come up with a number today.
Somebody came up with a number, it was
I'm not
in the
sure
stuff
the
we were given.
2012 number is relevant up there, but
Right.
certainly the number for 2013 and 2030 is.
He's
So-
talking
It's the same number.
about the, yeah.
So I think that, you know, in the end, whether this has any value to our process, it may not, but I wanted you guys, since the last thing you may have seen was the 2012 program, to understand where we are now. We may drop that off in the end because it's too confusing, because we don't have apples to apples comparisons.
So the 2012 program was the net result, the final summary that Nichols-Melberg did
Okay.
based on our direction to reduce
Okay.
his original programming by 25%.
Okay.
Yeah.
Or something like that.
Okay.
So were they
And
net
I didn't
numbers? Were they net
He
numbers?
brought them up to a gross
They
level.
were
He did,
gross.
They were
but
gross.
he
Yeah,
only
loaded
used like
there.
3.5%, I think.
His
and
grossing factors on the department gross were very small, and then he
Very
only
small.
used 20% on the building gross.
Yeah.
In the
Okay,
end.
so did you kick it back to a net number?
She's using a 15% load.
I used a 15% load, he had used like 2022. The library, person who just did your update used a 10%, and he used no department gross factors, I guess assuming it's all one building, mostly one
Internal,
space,
yeah,
internal.
right, above.
I have built in
No,
some
but that's not
other,
exactly
That's
right.
not correct.
yeah, you might wanna ask him,
Well,
cause,
I know what he did.
Okay.
We totally went through it.
okay,
He-
good.
It's a 20% load gross, but he extracted restrooms and put them in separately, which would normally be in the building gross
Okay.
factor.
Yeah,
So it's a 20%.
okay, so he has 20% on the net spaces.
When you count the restrooms, it's 20%.
Okay, and then at the end, you put another 20, or you put another
Yeah.
10% when he added it all
He-
together.
No, that 10% is part of the 20. He just broke out the restrooms and treated them
Oh.
separately.
Right.
Okay, and he did not put any grossing factor
Not
on any of those other
Not your
rooms.
second grossing factor.
Yeah,
whatever
he
you
didn't,
call it.
put, he's basically saying that the only load factor you're gonna have in the library is what you add in terms of exterior walls and maybe little,
And a
some little,
mechanical room.
yeah, mechanical room or two,
And
some circulation.
administrative room probably.
Yeah. Well, cause he
That's
called out
actually
every,
included in the
yeah,
staff,
he
but
called everything else
a
out.
mechanical room, probably
Yeah.
a storage room,
Mhm.
and the restrooms he pulled
He
out,
called
so
out-
the exterior walls,
Yeah,
that's
it's really
exactly
mostly
right.
walls and maybe a mechanical room,
That's-
is about
that's
all he's
basically
allowed
what
for,
it is.
yeah.
On the EOC, and it's been a long time since we looked at that, my memory was something was doubling as the EOC.
Yes, but,
And so it wasn't not included, it was,
well, in the 2012
Companion use.
program though, the space is not accounted for. So the
Didn't-
office that the supervisor currently sits in and the office for the contract maintenance group are actually called out in that program. But, you know, they're around a big space with a kitchenette and there's a little workstation in the corner. That's not listed. It's not all captured. So that's what my note means, that the EOC wasn't included. You know, if you look at line by line, we couldn't find, you know, we were in the space, and we're like, well, I can't find where this is exactly noted in the 2012 program. He had some support spaces kind of generally listed,
yeah.
but I couldn't pick it out to
Well,
be
maybe
sure it
what
was covered.
I wanted to call it, maybe wasn't there, and it was,
Which was nothing.
our goal is to be efficient.
Exactly.
Right, we wanna cover everything, but we also, we don't wanna build redundant spaces. Like, We
Exactly.
don't wanna have multiple lobbies for different
Yep.
departments if they
Yep.
can share a
Right.
lobby,
Yeah.
and they can share conference rooms, and they can do things together.
So that's
Or
part
lunch
of what I
breaks,
want to
yeah.
talk
I
about.
think at one time, we
Well,
thought maybe the EOC could be part of like a large, meeting room or something.
There's lots of things it can be.
Within our,
Mhm.
Town hall,
town hall.
Yeah.
yeah.
You know,
EOC
Yeah.
stands for
emergency
Yeah.
operation out.
It's when you
So,
have a massive emergency,
Yeah.
it's where they set up.
so just highlighting some of those differences, you know, it wasn't specifically captured to know how it was intended to be covered when the 2012 program was put together. I could imagine,
That
just
makes
like you, like, oh, I saw a fairly big conference room, I bet that's what they're thinking.
Mm-hmm.
But we wanna make sure it's all, even if it says see common spaces, you know, we wanna make sure every part of the EOC function is represented,
Exactly.
even if it's shared with 3 other things.
Sure.
And so we're trying to track in that way. The other thing that was not anywhere in that program was the actual program for council chambers. Yeah, So it was not accounted for at all. And what's here is obviously not an adequate size, so we also put something in that would be the appropriate size for, I think I was talking to George of, you know, if you wanted to accommodate an audience of 50 to 60 people, plus your dais, your council, your staff members, you know, chair storage, and a flexible space for converting into workshop type format, it's much bigger than this room. So we put a proper sized council based on those statistics in, which was not accounted for in the 2012 program at all.
Is that
Didn't show up
included
anywhere.
in the
Because
common
we told
areas?
them in 2012,
Yes.
we didn't want to
Yes.
touch this building.
That's right, and so, yeah.
Exactly.
So this building was not
Yeah.
even part of
So
it.
that's probably our biggest,
And
most
the
significant
council,
delta.
yeah, and so the council was never even part of the new building.
Yeah, yeah.
So what else is
that's-
in common areas?
So let's, in common areas, I have, and this is where, let me go to this slide so you can start to see some of the duplication or potential sharing. Because in the common areas, different departments mentioned or accounted for conference space, meeting space, restrooms, etc. So we basically, I noted it every time it was mentioned. Then I also did common spaces. And what I put together here for us to look at today is all the times I saw overlapping, and people indicated, well, we can share if they're nearby, whatever. So I see a lot of overlap that I've captured from everybody's program in these couple of slides. So in the city manager program, there was a dedicated conference room requested, but then there was an additional couple of small conference rooms that were requested by the city attorney. Then there's the typical copy and workroom, coffee areas, closets. These appeared, you know, several times. In the library, there's the library program room, kind of your program, multi-purpose, community type space that you guys were talking about,
Yeah.
dubs for training, whatnot. So I put that on the list as well in case there's a sharing opportunity. In planning and public works, there again was mention of a conference room, which right now is kind of that EOC room, where that's where, you know, the staff can meet. Again, workroom, coffee area, co-closet, the 3 Cs. Then I also called out the EOC to say, well, there was a kitchenette. That space also is now doubling as a break room, but I also said it's in the common areas. I didn't duplicate it in the public works department. But again, and they have restrooms in that facility that are dedicated to the EOC when it's in operation. But again, in the common spaces, I have restrooms too, and the police have restrooms, and city manager, you know, everybody mentions restrooms, but in the end, when we do a person count of who's gonna occupy the buildings, we will hone that down. We don't need, you know, 1 million restrooms. We need code required count of restrooms.
Good.
And then, there were just kind of some other things, you know, just some miscellaneous things that I also saw in the EOC that just because they happen to be in that building. But if we have an arrangement of space in the new facility that has all these functions collected in an area, we don't have to duplicate it especially for the EOC. So again, I just wanted to call out everything that's currently in that building, that when it's activated, you have in one general location, so that we make sure that, well, we don't want to duplicate it, that we don't miss anything
Yeah.
that you need.
Did we put in any space for emergency power supplies?
The building up now, I think there is a generator, right?
Right,
Yes,
I mean, I think we may want to.
Yeah.
You know,
We may
I,
want to
That'd be
consider putting
exterior.
in much better.
The
We just wanna
generator
make sure it's
exterior.
covered,
the
yeah.
generator's exterior, but there's a fuel tank exterior, then a generator interior usually. So we will need to account for that, so it's
For
a
an
good
EOC,
point.
you have to have.
You
that.
have to have it
Yeah.
if you're gonna function as an EOC. So right now I have some like miscellaneous mechanical in my common spaces, which, you know, could potentially, but we'll check it and make sure that we, again, maybe I'll pull something in here so that everyone knows it has to travel with the EOC. Whatever you say, ultimately, this is my box of where my EOC is going. We know what has to be accounted for. But again, you know, these don't have to be duplicated functions. Any kind of break and kitchenette that you build that could be your EOC could be your staff break room, any other time of use. So I wanted to bring all these things in the public areas and the staff areas that I did put in the common spaces. You know, main lobby and reception. Well, there's counter space requested by Public Works and Building and Planning. They need counter space and queuing space. City manager needs queuing space for the post office and some waiting and whatnot for that counter. There's a whole bunch of counter and queuing and waiting requirements that each department expressed. And then there's some entry somewhere, you kind of walk into something. So, I put a little extra in there, but if we're doing one big building, you may not have to duplicate so much area to accommodate all of those functions. So again, I put it on the list as potential shared duplication. Things like the council chambers are on here, not so much that I think you're gonna share this space all the time if it's set up for council chambers, but if you have 4 community rooms that you're listing that hold around 50 or 60 people, and you have council chambers, and you can reconfigure the floor into a workspace or workshop room, you probably don't need that many. And right now you have the council chambers, and you have the library program room, and I think we have a community room right now plugged into the police department, and then we have some other, sort of medium to larger conference rooms in the 2 other city departments. So we have quite a few meeting and conference spaces of varying sizes. And then again, restrooms, they're showing up many times, and I think, you guys don't have to worry about that. We'll be responsible for when we kind of know where everything sits. We'll do some code-related calculations and hone in on that, and then based on our schemes, we'll distribute them accordingly. But again, just to show you that, we have like 7,000 square feet here. This is only net area. This is not grossed up at all. That maybe we only need half of by the time we're done. So
we might get back to 18,000 feet or something. There's no police department.
There's no police department yet, so yeah, hold on to your hat on that.
Yeah, but the library, it was 18 before the library.
Yeah. So, my
So,
question
can
to
I-
you, yeah.
One question,
Please.
kind of a detailed thing, but in the planning and building public works department, I don't see anything there for plan storage, for the plans that they're working on.
There was a file room, and the file room is meant to both have like file cabinet and file storage as well as plan storage. I haven't really noted it or spelled it out that way, but there's some general files room storage for the whole.
It's under support areas, file
Yeah.
records room and planning supply storage.
Yeah, so I just lumped it all together.
And
The
was
more we
it,
digitize, the less we need. So.
Right.
are we, is that something they're exploring with the departments? What's our digitization
They said they
plan?
were, yeah. So it's not, actually, it is not a hugely generous file storage kind of space. It does presume that there is some of that conversion to electronic media and possibly use of, compressible shelving as well, if you.
I think that works great for plans that you want to keep for the long term, but
Right.
plans that are, the buildings that are being built.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, so there's definitely, that was carried forward from the 2012 plan and pretty much validated when we spoke to the users. So I think that's probably pretty adequate. Part of what we're gonna do is put a little contingency or build into the grossing factor, not the smallest grossing factor we can do in the end for these kinds of things, is we don't know everything today. We don't wanna put you in a position where something is compromised so that you can't actually meet your functional need. We're not gonna be so generous that, it makes it unaffordable or ridiculous either. So we're gonna try and use our judgment. So some of these things, we wanna make sure we have the function, we might wanna make sure based on what we've heard, it's of a reasonable size, but if it's 50 square feet too small, and eventually somebody designs it, it's probably fine. We're gonna make sure that it's not gonna be a deal breaker, that type of thing. We just don't wanna completely miss staff positions or whole functions. So, if you do see anything else like that as you are looking more carefully, please let me know. I found a few things myself since I sent you this, so we're constantly over the next couple of weeks making sure that we haven't missed anything.
Have your notes been circulated back to staff?
Yeah, you have them, and I probably will be scheduling with Gordon a follow-up to see if staff have any comments and who we need to circle back with. Because there were some areas that, you talk in circles sometimes.
Yeah.
Well, we could do this, and they could share, and these two could share, and
It's a creative
okay,
process.
no, not those two people. No, these two people will share. Well, those three can go in an office. Okay, I think I have it. So, there's some of that we have to check out.
So I have a question.
Yes.
I think that your drive to maximize efficiencies between potentially shared space is exactly the right thing to do, because that's what we want to focus on.
Yeah.
there's two factors that are really big deals, which is what percent you use,
Yes,
the gross factors.
yes,
Because it's a plug number.
yes,
And it's reasonable, there's obviously external walls, and there's
Yes.
clearly some mechanical rooms and other components of a building that need to be provided for.
yes.
But when we did this in the library, we had agreed initially to a 20% gross factor. And we went through all kinds of schemes in terms of what comes into that gross factor and what the range is of gross factors that are used by planners. And we agreed to the 20% to, within the gross up number, that would include restrooms, mechanical room, that, as well as exterior walls. But then Brad explicitly identified the square footage for the restrooms, and he reduced that gross factor from 20 to 10. If I look through what you've got mechanical rooms and restrooms
Yeah,
already provided for, and you're using a 15% gross up, so that sounds like a lot to me.
it
Now,
probably.
there may be, wait, let me just finish, there
Yeah.
may be hallways in some of the,
Yes.
Planning department and the administrative department and the police department that make that reasonable. I'm not challenging that, I'm just saying, it's a number that has a huge impact.
It does.
And for the library, where we've done the review, I am confident that that number's too high. Because we
Can I ask a
came to
big
10.
picture question though? The goal of this exercise is not to do space planning.
Right.
The goal of
Right.
this exercise is to set aside adequate footprints for
Right.
buildings so we can feel their relationship.
Right.
My point is, when you use a gross factor, which you have to use some number, it changes the footprint.
Right,
All
you
I'm
don't
saying-
wanna make
but
it too big.
It's not gonna be
Absolutely.
material, because it's like a pizza.
Well, I think
You know, going from a 12-inch pizza to a 14-inch pizza, you add a massive amount of area, but it doesn't take up a bigger footprint.
So-
Going from
But
10
what
to
I'm-
20 could
Wait, it does
be
do material.
material.
But we are not gonna resolve any of this until we have an architect.
Right.
It's just,
So-
we're gonna chase our tail around and around, and so she may have
But we
erred
set some
on,
expectation with the public when we're talking to the public and they're looking at growth.
we're just doing site planning.
numbers.
And
This
what,
is just site
what
planning.
worries me is, if we put a huge number out there,
Right,
we aren't gonna go to the next step.
right. So, I wanted to go through our next steps for you, because it speaks to your point. So, those are numbers I hold because when you get into planning, office space, spaces in schools, police stations, they tend to have higher grossing factors at the department level. There's a lot of individual rooms, there's a lot of quarters, there's public and private circulation. That's usually our starting point for many of those types of facilities, both city offices as well as police facilities. In the case of the library, in the case of if you were just doing this as a single council chambers, your grossing factors would be far lower, as you've pointed out. You're absolutely correct, because you essentially have one or two big rooms and some walls. you
Single
know?
story too.
Exactly.
And single story.
Yeah.
So one of the things you're not seeing, because we haven't gotten all the net areas pinned down and finalized, is we actually have a method we use to analyze grossing factors in a very logical, specific fashion, based on something I mentioned a little earlier. Are these a bunch of single buildings? Are they multi-story? Are they single-story? How many have percentages of very large open spaces and few private rooms and corridors versus public and private circulation that you have to separate and duplicate and much higher grossing factors? In fact, each particular use is probably going to have a different resulting grossing factor because of the nature of its use. We haven't gotten to that point yet, so I would say for now, when I said it's not going to be worse than this, that's why I did it this way. So what you saw today would be, an industry standard approach for more sophisticated, higher grossed types of buildings. It will come down, but it will still vary use to use when we get done with this.
One other thing we wanted to encourage when we get to actual space planning, but since you're doing massing now, was to think flexible use, long-term.
Yes.
That, it's not, there may not be hard walls between
Right.
departments. You may have privates and cubes, and the cubes may move from
Right.
whose cubes are they today, and how far do our cubes go, and do those pick up, so that
Yep.
we're not locked into our walls here and their walls there, and now what do we do?
And the other things that we're looking at, which you may or may not have started to see the patterns in the detail, is when someone says, I want a private office and I need a table and chairs and I need 2-3 guests, you know, whatever, and someone else says I need a conference room for 4 people, we're also looking at, you know what, that's the same size. Today it's a conference room, the next day you hire some staff, it's an office. Or it's an office, can this size that you're using for a 4-person conference room also work for a shared office of 2 people who might be hoteling, and they're not there all the time, so they're not in each other's faces. So we're also looking at that kind of flexibility and modularity in all of these spaces, so that what we settle on, you know, so we don't have like an 80 square foot and 100 square foot and 110 square foot and 120 square foot and 140 square foot, different sets of offices. So we're also cleaning that up so that we're giving you something reasonable that when you do go to plan this, you actually have an understanding of a modular approach that rooms can serve multi-purposes. So between fewer walls and the rooms you do build being suitable to be either a conference room or a shared office or a single large executive office or whatever, it gives you more flexibility in the future when the uses have to shift around without moving rooms. So we're also doing that level as we go along and trying to clean that up as we see it across the board. All workstations, we're making them all the same size, that type of thing. All the counter stations are the same size. So we're also cleaning that up as we go around the program so that where we saw some anomalies, it's like, you know, why are we doing this? You know, it's just one more different thing, and now it's special. So we're also trying to clean some of that up as we go along too, and we get to a final point. And as you were stating earlier, all this is to get us to footprints. But we also don't want to scare everyone away because we're also going to give you an eventual dollar ticket on this. So we also need to be mindful of, as we go through the process, whatever those footprint numbers are, that you all agree that we've reached a reasonable point when we conclude this process.
And do we need those numbers for next week?
No. No, we're not sharing any of this with the public.
I just
Next
want
week.
You are
I
right
just want to make it really clear that
Not in terms of what we want them to do next week. We are not asking them to work with any of this or react to any of this yet.
So as far as like, you know, we have a public building, we're gonna build, you know, a new administration, council chambers or whatever, police station. We don't want a City of Mountain View, public building with
Right.
massive soaring,
Exactly.
whatever, and
No.
lots of
Yeah.
open space, you know, because that
Right.
adds a tremendous
Yes.
amount to the load factor, to
Yes.
the gross.
You know,
And, you know, it's very, we want something that can be, you know, used really by everybody,
Yeah.
you know, with the separation that's necessary for the police, but, you know, so that it's, so keep that really
Yeah,
small.
one of the things we're pretty skimpy on, I mean, you know, this is the only nod given to anything other than specifically programmed counter and queuing space that's been requested for any kind of lobby so far. So, you know, I think this is something we're trying to be reasonable, but also kind of skimpy on, because you have the ability to circulate outdoors.
Yeah,
If
I
you
think
made a
that's-
courtyard and all your circulation was outdoors, you don't need a
We
bunch of
should
big
talk
lobby
about
space.
that. You know, indoor, outdoor didn't come up much in our,
No, we didn't get that far.
yeah, but that's something to think about
Yes.
as your site planning is, where are some spaces that you slide the doors back and it's,
You know,
Yeah.
Well, I
have your
think
reception outside.
There's two things there. One, and we've talked about it from the library perspective, one is the importance of the outdoor common courtyard as what's big and open and airy, not needing, I mean, we want high ceilings because it feels good, but the outside common area is really important, I think, for this community.
Yes.
The other is, if, like with the library, if you have high windows that look out into like the park area, right, then you pull the outside in without having to expand your footprint.
but
Yeah,
for our community rooms, these big rooms, if you can open up the wall,
exactly.
and now you've doubled the size of the room on a
Yeah.
summer day for a
Yeah.
giant
the
event.
thing we decided for in the library, with indoor, outdoor, they
Yes.
all have to be controlled. In
Yes.
other words, you don't come into the outdoor without going in, first of all, through the indoor.
Yeah, some kind of
Not
fence.
open
If there's a
spaces.
real outdoor
It's
space
secure.
that you
Yeah.
walk into, it
Yeah.
has to be
Yeah.
Yeah.
fenced.
And we talked about that with the library
Yeah.
committee, that, you know, if there's any indoor-outdoor movement, we have to be mindful of security within the library. So, you know, they might be planned in some of our schemes where, you know, there's a way that you get into the library, but they have a section that's an outdoor courtyard, but it's all secured and part of their footprint, so to speak. Whereas the buildings in the whole Civic Center might be clustered around some kind of a courtyard type treatment, and you can walk freely up to any of them to do your business. So, you know, our options are also going to dictate where we land on some of this kind of space, because if option A is, let's pretend it was a single building, you know, you would need more lobby space because everyone would come to a single point. You'd have to do something with them. If you ended up with 5 individual buildings scattered throughout the Civic Center site, you may not need virtually any lobbies other than each department accounted for already. So we have a last exercise to do that actually is going to be informed by some of the planning that Matthew and David, our lead designer, are going to do when they start looking at big moves on options. And that's going to be the last piece that starts to refine what those footprints are in the different scenarios, because there are just realities about lobbies, no lobbies, indoor, outdoor space. What we did program for exterior space very specifically were the functional exterior program needs like parking. So wherever we heard that someone said, I need parking for 4 staff members or 6 staff members, or the secured parking for police, we've captured that. So we actually know, at least based on what we heard, some notion of a parking count to plan for and what we might be needing to take up in parking. Where people have mentioned a desire for outdoor space, we have not set a value to it because we haven't heard a programmatic functional need, but we'll simply account for it as we plan and suggest outdoor space relationships.
And in the library discussions, one of the things that have been important to us, that space has to be allowed for the entryways.
Yes.
In other words, we want to make a very, very attractive entryway there. And that's not covered space, but it's still space that you have to take into account.
Yes.
I've got a question about the bare, I'm sorry, go ahead, I was gonna, I thought you were. I just had a question about the bare bones concept that, you know, in the master planning. And, Jim, I'm sorry, I thought we were done with the, exterior. Did you have something else to say? Did you have anything else to say about the exterior of the convert?
No, I think that's a good point. I mean, we definitely will capture that.
The bare bones concept, are you going to be pursuing any of the bare bones, you know, versus the, you know, wish list things, and how does that incorporate into the master planning?
We have some meetings scheduled with you during the process, and there's a meeting kind of mid-October, I think, as we have some early options going. That would be the point in time that we would bring that discussion back to if we see potential concerns or we see potential opportunities in that way. If we've heard, for example, as we're finishing up our programming, that there were some things that were desired, but, well, if we can't afford it, we understand. We'll try and listen for that. We'll wrestle with some options. And then when we meet with you again in October at a couple of our progress meetings, we'll probably bring a lot of that to the table. If we see something where, because we're also going to be asking our cost estimator as we look at options for like order of magnitude cost ballparks. So for example, if we end up with 20,000 square feet of programmed space and we tell her it's all single story, assume it's in 4 different structures, give us a square footage for these types of uses, what does that look like? Oh, here's an option where we're going to have 2 buildings, and these are the relative functions in it. One of them will be 2 stories. Give us order of magnitude square footage for that. When we get to that point and we come to you in our October meeting, that's when we'll probably be able to have any kind of discussion that says, we've really got to strip something down so that we're more in this range. We're going to try and get an idea from you where you're more comfortable and where you start to think a more tolerable, well, this really has to be our base. And you can go from here for any other variations.
So space-wise, do you allow the space for any future growth? I mean, will that be something that would consider, or do we just sort of decide at that point in time that this is what we want in the foreseeable future?
From everything we're hearing, and that there's not really any anticipation of any significant growth, what you'll probably see is that with any of the options and layouts, we'll identify if you ever had to expand, here's an area you could easily expand into. If you ever had to expand, here's a zone that we would say is suitable. We'll probably handle any potential growth that way, because right now, our master plan is going to say that you know, no growth in the foreseeable future is planned, you know, for your civic center.
Right. I'm not thinking about growth in terms of staffing, I'm just thinking about additional functions. that
Right,
might
changes
be-
in services or
Right.
functions you add
Adding a bell
in.
or whistle,
Pardon me?
adding a bell or whistle.
Right.
Yeah, so.
That we weren't able
Yes.
to afford early on.
Yes, exactly,
Right?
over time.
Yeah, so I think right now, the best point I see to have that discussion is when we have a few options on the table, we're beginning to look at them. When we come for our progress meetings in October, that's probably the right point in time to start putting some of these things on the table and start evaluating, you know, against the different options. You know, yeah, well, where would you add something if we can't do it now? Or how could you phase this or ratchet this back if we don't think we can do everything that you're showing in this option? So we'll be able to, I think, have that discussion better at that point in time.
I'm not comfortable, and this doesn't reflect on you, with, this shouldn't reflect on the staff, but I'm gonna be very cautious on the numbers, that when you go and ask each person what they want, we're not gonna get something that's overblown. And since I'm gonna have to sell it to the community, I'm real worried about that.
Just to clarify in terms of what we ask them, basically the way we approach our discussions is tell me what you do, tell me what function you perform, show me your workspace, tell me, you know, how many visitors you have, how many people come, what do they come for. We basically have the conversation that isn't asking them what do they need or want. I mean, certainly we encourage that, but we really drill down as to what do you need to perform your job. And we ask the questions in those manners, and we look at the spaces they're in now, and we look at how they're compromised or what's working. With the police, it's a whole different avenue where we have the expertise to actually understand how they're supposed to operate. So it's even a little different there, where they can say everything in the world that they want, and we're going to recognize what's a want and what's, well, you know, well, we know you can't operate without that. It's not safe. You know,
And you really don't want to duplicate what they've got over here.
No.
Okay.
Please, no. So I think, you know, just to reassure you as much as I can in the way that we operate, you know, that's always like, you know, every owner's nightmare is, you know, please don't ask the staff what they want. But, you know, I mean, any of the staff that we've asked, I mean, you know, we've been asking questions like, okay, well, do you need to meet with people in your office? Or is one guest chair sufficient? Or are you there all the time? Are you full-time or not? Could you share